Hello, and welcome back. I'll be building a PC today to replace my current editing and gaming machine. I'll also be crafting a miniature glass PC to place inside of the large one for a little decorative touch. There will be important building tips at the end, so make sure to watch the entire video through before you begin your build, even before you order parts. And so sit back and enjoy this special episode here on the Jasa channel. And now it's not too difficult to build a computer. All you need are your hands and a screwdriver. The hard part is doing the research to make sure that the parts are compatible and are powerful enough to fit your needs. There are some little bits of knowledge, like knowing to install your motherboard standoffs in the case so that the motherboard doesn't sit directly on the back panel. And only the standoffs you need for your size of board. You don't want any extra touching the back, causing a short. This case came with 4 pre-installed. This is a mini ITX case, and so it won't accept any larger sizes. However, larger cases normally will fit smaller boards, and so you have to make sure your board will fit before you buy it. I'll use the 4 screws to mount the board to the case, and then flare out this tubing to connect it up to a larger one. I chose this board for the faster DDR5 memory and the PCIe 4.0 hard drive. For gaming, this faster storage may not be beneficial, but for editing, I feel it might. We have the secondary 2.M drive on the bottom, and a couple of Easter eggs, the ROG symbol and those little 2 game characters on the back. Plenty of USBs on the I/O panel, but no support for the older PS2 inputs. 5.1 audio support on the bottom with microphone and line in. And so a compact board with all the basic necessities. We'll check out the headers here at the top. From left to right, these plug in the case fan, CPU fan, AIO cooler, and then 2 LED strips, a 5 and 12 volt. And now it's very important that this triangle on the motherboard is lined up with this triangle on the CPU. They're pointing to pin 1, which shows you which way to orientate the chip. Also, don't remove this plastic cover early, as it's protecting from dust and debris from settling in the socket. And here is 1700 gold pins. They're very delicate. You don't want to touch these with your fingers. And I've accidentally placed it on the lip of the socket. I'll just tap it over, but not push down. That's what this bracket is for. And now that I have my blow tube connected, I'll flame cut a small section off for the glass case. And so which processor you decide to choose will depend on your budget and the performance you need. A CPU's speed is rated in gigahertz, along with a certain amount of cores. Gaming isn't normally too CPU intensive, and some applications will only utilize 2 cores. And now, as I'm closing this lever, you can hear this metallic creaking noise that sounds concerning. However, I read this can come from the hinge in the locking mechanism and not the CPU itself. And so I'll install the backplate for the CPU cooler. This model didn't come with a stock version, and so I had to purchase an aftermarket one. Now you'll want to refer to the instructions on your CPU cooler, as they will differ greatly from this one. But here I'm installing the base in which the CPU cooler mounts onto and is held in place. I also popped a hole in this tubing to rip it in half and leave the end open. I'll put on my face mask as well, as things are going to start to heat up. And now I went with this 92mm heatsink, mainly for the height. I would normally recommend a 120 or 140 millimeter, but most of those wouldn't fit in this case. And now I'll practice applying my thermal paste, as it's been over a decade since my last build. Normally, the longer you can wait before you upgrade your computer, the bigger performance boost you'll see. And so this newer i5 is faster and has more cores for half the cost of what I've paid for my old i7. And now that was way too much thermal paste. We want to cover the chip without going over the edges. The classic method is to do a little blob in the middle, about the size of a green pea or corn kernel. But since this chip is a rectangle, I figured a line would be more appropriate. And now the CPU fan is overhanging the memory slots. I was trying to make more room for the rear fan, but it looks like I'll have to use slim fans instead. I'll have to remove the cooler, clean it up, flip it a 180, and repaste. And as I'm pulling hard to get this heatsink off, I notice there's paste everywhere. Still, too much. But this gives me the opportunity to show you how to clean the old compound off and repaste, which is something you might have to do after a few years when it starts to dry out and lose its efficiency. I'm wiping it down with a paper towel moistened with isopropyl alcohol. I'll clean off the cooler as well, get it back to a mirror finish. Again, I'll try to apply a very thin line, which I can squish out into a very thin layer. But again, just way too much. I almost need like a syringe or some kind of different applicator. So I'll just use my library card to remove some excess and even up that line. I know this looks a little unorthodox, but I think you understand the idea. Enough to cover the chip, but not so much we go over the sides. And now I'll reinstall the CPU cooler and tighten it down evenly between both sides to make sure it goes down level. It might look like the surfaces of the CPU and the cooler are very smooth, but under a microscope, it would just be a mountain range of gaps and valleys. And so the thermal paste will fill in all the gaps, push out all the air, and improve thermal conductivity when applied in a thin layer. This is computer memory, which is kind of like a human memory. It holds onto information as long as the application is running or as long as you have an idea, and then erases it to make room for a new application or new ideas. The speed and capacity of the memory need to match the motherboard precisely. This board only accepts DDR5 at 4800 Hz and up to 64 gigabits of capacity. For gaming, you might not need the full 64 gigs, but for editing, it does stack up quite a bit in the editor. And so you want to open the locking mechanisms before you insert the memory, align the gap with the notch in the motherboard, then push firmly down on both sides until the locking mechanism clicks into place. And now that I have my glass case blown out into a sphere, I'm going to use my graphite paddle to form it into a rectangle. I'll set up the CPU cooler fan, which can be placed to either push or pull air through the heatsink. I normally find pulling air makes the least noise, but you can use both push and pull for the most efficiency. I'll remove the heat spreader from the 2.M drive. These are important as these drives do get pretty warm. If the motherboard doesn't have a heat spreader, you can purchase them aftermarket like the CPU cooler. This 2.M is a newer technology for me. It's essentially a more compact, faster hard drive. It connects directly into the motherboard without going through cables, like all the drives before it. It does plug in at a slight angle, about 10 or 20 degrees, and so it's not parallel with the board. I'll align the notch and push it in, then on the other side I'll push it down towards the board and lock it down with this mechanism. And as I do that, I'll pull out a little bit of glass from the bottom of the glass PC and blow out a pressure release hole. This will help keep it from imploding in the kiln. I'll have to use my toothpick again to close this lever. Some of these parts are getting too small to reach. And now, even though the 2.M does have a higher rated speed, it could become bottlenecked waiting for or communicating with other devices, such as a flash or mechanical drive going through the USB interface, which is how I store and load my videos. But now for gaming, it may only affect the loading screens, possibly shorten them. And so if you're coming from a mechanical drive, you will see a huge boost in performance, but coming from SATA, they're already particularly fast, and so you may be bottlenecked by another component. And so the thermal bubblegum wasn't sticking to the heat spreader. I decided to apply it to the 2.M instead. It does the same thing as the thermal paste, except with a more solid consistency. I blew out a hole in the side of the glass PC. I'm going to remove some extra glass to open up the side of the case. And so here's a SATA drive right here. It's sort of the same technology, but with a metal case built around it, and it doesn't connect directly to the motherboard, which can speed up the communication. It uses special connectors, the SATA power cable, and SATA data cable. You can recognize the connectors by its L-shaped port. And so you can install multiple drives to increase your capacity and separate the data, or combine the drives together in what's called a RAID and have them run faster. You can also install one large drive and separate it into multiple partitions or virtual drives. I'll show you that later when we get to the software side of this video. I gathered up a marble of glass and flattened it out. I'll square it up to be the motherboard for the glass PC. I'll remove a couple of brackets in the back of the case to install the graphics card. It's normally best to go with the most recently released GPUs and CPUs. Every new generation, they become faster and more energy efficient, which by consuming less energy, it also produces less heat, which is one of the main enemies of computer components. You'll need to choose the video card which will provide the performance for your needs, as well as fit into your budget, as these can range from $200 to $1,000. You can check online benchmarks or even videos here on YouTube of different people testing different cards in different games. And so for gaming, it's this component, the GPU, which will give you the biggest boost in performance. If you're on a budget, you could save some money on a faster memory and hard drive, as well as go with a more affordable CPU like the i5, and then pile all of those savings into a bigger graphics card. And now I'm having an issue getting this GPU seated correctly. You can see the gold pins sticking up on the left side. It's also impossible to reach the locking mechanism without a screwdriver or some tool. The backplate might be rubbing up against the motherboard or the back of the case. It normally just pushes straight down, but after a few tries, I got it installed. I'll tighten the screws in the back of the case to keep it fully mounted in. I'm also working on the motherboard for the glass PC. I'm using a knife to carve in little ridges for the heatsink. Next, I picked up a smaller form factor power supply, an SFX size. Before you buy your power supply, you need to calculate the max power consumption of the system. This PC will consume about 420 watts at most, which means it will power down during idle or low loads and consume only about 100 watts. And now I'll add a glob of glass next to the cooler and use my knife to split it in two to form two memory sticks. I'll make a glass video card as well, but that'll be it. It's not going to be very detailed. And so I went with a 600 watt power supply, as it's a little safer to go above your max power consumption. That way you're not running the power supply at full load. Another thing to consider is the efficiency. They're rated in percentages. And so an 80 plus power supply will waste 20% of the power converting it from AC to DC. And so if that system were to consume 100 watts, it would actually be pulling 120 out of the outlet. And those 20 watts would turn into heat, which, as I said before, is the enemy of computer components. And so this case routes the power back through a cord. You normally install the power supply on the back of the case. So depending on your design, it may be different. I'll plug in the 24 pin to the power supply, which is the main power connector for the motherboard. I'll also install additional connectors for the CPU, video card, and a Molex connector for extra fans. I won't plug in a SATA connector as I'm not planning to install that drive. I use large external USB drives to back up my videos. So I'm planning to run the computer just off that 2.m drive, but if I need more storage, I can add that in later. Now I'll push in these connectors until they're fully seated and click into place. The 24 pin, the CPU, and the GPU. If you're having trouble finding them, refer to your manual, as it should have a map of all the connectors and features. I'm also going to take some time to wrap up my cords with zip ties. This can improve the airflow and make the case more aesthetically pleasing. And although this case was a bit pricey, there are plenty of features and spots to tie cables down. Next up, which is important, is to plug in the power and reset switch in order to turn the computer on. There's multiple pins with these small connectors, and so you have to double check the manual to make sure you're putting it in the right spot. These ones are bundled together, which is a new one for me, but I checked the manual. They seem to be in the right order. Next up will be the front audio and front USB headers. And now you don't need to use up all the headers on the motherboard. There might be some that your case isn't wired for, or your case might have features that the motherboard isn't prepared for. Just the 24-pin CPU, video card, and power switch are going to be the most important. And now some fans have arrows on the sides to indicate which direction the airflow will go. If they don't, it's good to remember that the side with the plastic housing, which is holding onto the motor, is normally the exhaust. The opposite side, the open area, is the intake. These were the only fans that came with the case. They are 4-pin, which means I can adjust their speed with software. But I'll have to use a splitter to plug both fans into the motherboard's case header. And now before I can insert the motherboard into the glass PC, I'll have to use my tweezers to open up the side of the case more. It's good to note that these fan headers can only take a certain amount of amperage before they burn out. The max for this motherboard is 1 amp per fan header. And so you have to add the amperage on the back of the fans to figure out how much power will draw. And now I'll install 2 fans from previous builds into the bottom. This will help provide the GPU with fresh, cold air, helping it run more cool. It can be a good idea to provide your major components, the CPU and GPU, with a source of fresh air, and then an equal amount of exhaust fans to have good airflow through the case. Now it's time to heat up the motherboard and the glass case and stick them together. I'll break the punty off and heat up the back of the case to fully melt it in. I am a bit worried of how close the bottom fans are to the GPU. However, these cards do have a 0 RPM mode, and so that should help keep the card cool when the fans are turning off. And now I'll place in and connect up the LED strips. I've always enjoyed adding lights to my build. However, they used to only have the cold cathode tubes, which could only emit one color of light. And so if you wanted to change the lighting scheme of your build, you'd have to go and buy new tubes. But now plugging these LED strips into the motherboard should allow me to change the lights with a click of a button. I plugged in the 5-volt LED header, which has a maximum of 3 amps. And the case fan header as well, which again only has a max of 1 amp. And now the back of the case is only drilled for a 92mm fan. However, I noticed if I use the grill holes, I could actually fit 2 80mm fans in there instead. I went with this concept for more airflow and hopefully over the board rather than just into the CPU. Then I noticed I can pop another fan in the back here with zip ties. This hole is meant to be an alternate position for the power supply. So I replaced the side panel to the glass PC, and now I'm fully melting it in. The Molex connector can supply plenty of power, about 4 amps or more, which will be enough for additional fans. But because they're 3-pin connectors and connect directly to the power supply, I can't change their speed with software. And now with the real build complete, the glass PC still needs feet. So I'll heat a glass rod and the PC and connect them in the flame. Then I'll go up about 1/2 inch, melt it off, and then shape that glass into a foot. Which to become molten requires 1500 degrees Fahrenheit or 815 Celsius. I normally like to route the cords behind the motherboard and then come back out, but these cords were so short, this was the best I could do. I'll attach a temporary handle to one of the feet, which we call a punty. It's normally just a glass rod. I'll melt off the top, heat and shape it flat, and then use my claws to get it in the kiln to anneal away the stress that gathered up during the creation process. And now the official reveal with the cling peel. You have to be careful not to knock the device over as you're peeling the cling off.
Ta-da! Ooh, look at how clear that is.
And now the kiln reveal for the glass PC. And it came out in one piece. That's always a great thing. And I'm liking it. I'll admit, it is a little difficult to see the components. These side panels didn't get as flat as I hoped. Any curvature is going to end up bending the light, a bit like a magnifying glass. I feel it does match the intentions I was going for, and for its inception, it will live its life forever inside the actual PC. So I've plugged in the power cord and then next the HDMI for the video card. Then I'll hook up my mouse, keyboard, and CD-ROM drive, all which go into the USB slots. The network cable goes in the square hole. The green port is for audio out, and the pink is for audio in, your microphone. Lastly, the built-in wireless if you want to go that route instead of the cable. I've switched on the power supply, now I'll push the power button. This can be the most nerve-wracking part of a build because everything comes down to this moment.
Uh-oh.
And it's not turning on. I tried unplugging things, plugging them back in, moving to a different outlet. This doesn't look good. And so it's kind of difficult to talk about the disappointment I was feeling, not just in the build, but in myself. I'm trying to teach and document the process, but now I feel as if I failed my viewers. But if there's one thing that life has taught me, it's not to give up. Where there's a will, there's a way, and nothing outweighs a determined spirit. I'm not going to jump to conclusions that I broke it. Instead, focus on the important factors that'll get it running. Maybe the power header was plugged in one pin too high. And so as I rechecked the manual, I noticed the motherboard has 9 pins while the connector only has 8. And so I moved it 1 pin down, and with that, we have lights, fans. It's working. I'll press F1 to jump into the BIOS, which stands for Basic Input Output System. It's like an operating system for the motherboard. It helps connect devices, set speeds and settings, and boot into the actual operating system, which in this case will be Windows. And so if you bought overclocked memory, you can use the XMP to set what speed you'll need. I believe Intel Rapid Storage is used to combine multiple drives into a RAID. And since I'm only using a single drive, I'm not sure if I need to activate that right now. But this is just the easy mode. It's pretty self-explanatory. I'll scroll quickly through the advanced menu. You might need to pause or slow down the video if you want to see all the options and features here. However, we shouldn't need to change too many things in here. If we change something that causes the system to become unstable, then there's a factory default that you can set all the settings back to. I'm mostly interested in the boot settings, as it hasn't recognized my CD-ROM or the 2.M hard drive. I'll enable the CSM option to see if that'll help it recognize the drives. And so this BIOS shows us what we're saving before we change it. If you're going with a different motherboard, the BIOS may look a lot different than this one. But now that it's recognized the drives, I want to go into the boot priority and make the CD-ROM the first boot and the hard drive the second. That should allow me to boot into the CD to install the operating system. I could also leave the hard drive as first boot and then use boot override to start up the CD directly. Once I save these options, it'll restart the computer, and I won't hit F1 to skip past the BIOS to install the operating system. And now at this point, I just need to press the Any key to get Windows installed. And as I get into the Windows 7 install, I notice my mouse and keyboard stop working. I read that Windows 7 doesn't support USB 3.0 without additional drivers. And this hardware won't support USB 2.0 for the same reason. And since I don't have any PS2 inputs, I'll just try Windows 10 instead. After you've inserted your key and accept the terms, you can go down to Custom Windows Install. This brings us to the Partition Manager, where we can split our physical drive into smaller virtual drives. We only need to create one partition, but Windows will create a second one for system files. Real quick, let me show you how to format and delete the partition. Just in case something happens to your Windows in the future, you can format the drive and start over. All you do is click Format and Delete on the primary and system partitions, and that's it. I'll separate 300 gigs to create a storage partition, so I'll have a C and a D drive. I have to remember to click on the 300 gigs, hit New, and Accept. Again, you don't need to create two partitions. Windows will only install on one. But if I need to save files to my storage partition, the D drive, then I can format and reinstall Windows on C without affecting those saved files on D. But the Windows installation should only take 5 to 10 minutes. We do have to hit OK on a bunch of things. And then we get to name the computer, put in a password if you need, and then hit OK a bunch more times. Once it starts talking to you, you know you're almost done. And now this Armory crate is another motherboard-specific feature. It'll automatically install drivers, which will allow me to connect to the internet, have great video.
Jasa. Check out some of the fun stuff my channel.
I want to show you how to find your drivers manually. Without this software, your devices may not work well or at all.
If you are interested,
You start by going to the website of your motherboard manufacturer and type in the model number to find the support page for that board. Here you'll find a list of the CPUs which are compatible and memory sticks which have been tested to be compatible as well. When you go to download, you may find the software you need: chipset, LAN driver, sound driver. And now to install these, you need to go to your downloads folder, extract them to another folder, and then look for the setup or install file and double click that. You'll click next a bunch of times, give it a minute, and it's done. Then the graphics drivers, which will help you fully utilize your GPU. You'll get these either from NVIDIA or AMD. They're the ones that create the chips and the software. Then companies like EVGA will buy the chips and additional parts to assemble the cards. Now from EVGA, we'll find the hardware monitoring software, which will allow us to set the clock speed and fan speed. This is the only way to adjust or turn off 0 RPM mode. And now with the software complete, let's get into the benchmarks. I'll be playing a few games in different resolutions, and we'll check out the video editing software as well. Then we'll check the numbers and see exactly how these parts stack up for your needs and mine. First up, Fallout 4 with a resolution of 1920 by 1080.
Residents of Sanctuary Hills, if you are registered,
I'll just run through the start of the game here. In case you want to compare it to your machine, it'll make it a little easier.
Vault 111.
I was noticing higher frame rate indoors, which is to be expected being a smaller area to render. And so the highest frame rate was 210, while the lowest was 80. It looks like it didn't utilize much of the processor, the system memory, or the video memory in the graphics card, while the GPU was up to a 99% load. And so it tells me this component is going to be the most crucial for a higher frame rate, as well as the graphics settings in the game, which these games are set to the highest, which will reduce the frame rate the most, as well as a higher resolution monitor like a 4K. This next test has been digitally upscaled to a 2.5K using NVIDIA software. And that's because I don't have a higher resolution monitor, but if I did, my frame rate would be much lower. Here we see 42 frames as the lowest. The highest was 96, but with a 69 average. Next up, Skyrim at 1920 by 1080, starting at the loading screen, which I believe my loading screens have improved a little bit compared to my old machine, which could be a result of the faster processor and not the 2.M. If you're coming from a mechanical hard drive, you should see a major improvement in loading times, but SATAs are particularly fast already that you might not see that much of an improvement unless you're transferring files. And now the FPS is looking pretty low for such an older game here. We do have a lot of special effects going on, and special effects can slow a game down. But now from what I've seen here in Fallout, I would say if you're planning to use a 4K monitor and have the highest graphics settings, you might want to go with a faster graphics card. We can see some bizarre things happening here in Skyrim. Some games can have some pathing issues with too much FPS. This is not how the game is supposed to go. I'm facing the wrong direction. That cart is still flipping around in the air. This horse doesn't know what's going on. My only option now is to hit escape and quit. So this game does have similar stats to Fallout, however with 21% CPU load. Now for another fun kart ride at 2880 by 1620. The frame rate has dropped quite a bit with an average of 58 FPS. And so if you're in this situation, a few of the graphic settings you can lower are the anti-aliasing, the shadows, and reflections. In a later test, I was able to get 50% more frame rate by dropping the anti-aliasing from 8 to 4. And so it depends on how important those video settings are for you. I personally don't remember the graphics as much when I think back about the games I've played. But now I'm running around in CSGO at 1920 by 1080. This game has smaller areas with less effects going on. And so we see a large boost in frame rate as well as CPU usage. this game does have a frame limiter set at 400, the average 270, which is a good way to limit excessive frame rendering, which can cut down on power consumption, which in turn will lower the heat of the component as well. And now I have played these games a lot in the past. However, because they're rated more for a mature audience, I'm just going with these small previews. And we see this repeating pattern of the video card being the most essential item. And now I'm not tracking memory speed, only capacity. Memory speed doesn't have a large effect on frame rate. However, you will need at least 11 gigs, most likely more for future games. And now Kerbal Space in 1080p. Takeoff in T-minus 3, 2, 1, launch. We've got some beautiful graphics here. A lot of effects going on, like the smoke from the thrusters. You can see the shadow of our vessel over here, cast by the light source over here. We have a nice reflection of that in the water, which can be very render intensive. We'll see that in the next higher resolution demo. And now I call this craft the 300-130, which stands for a 300-ton lifting stage, a 100-ton orbital stage with a 30-ton payload. And so here's my trajectory here, from where I was to where I'm going. As I increase in speed, you'll see that line begin to grow. And there's the moon in the background as we start to see some stars appear. The galaxy is represented by this line here. You can see that in our normal sky on a clear night and a little bit away from the city, away from the light pollution, which blocks starlight. So you have to travel 45 minutes away from the city, more into a rural area to get the best view. But now I'll separate the first and second stage once we leave the atmosphere completely. This will lower the mass of the craft, allowing the remaining fuel to potentially deliver a greater distance, as an object with less mass will require less force to accelerate. And now as I begin to clear the engine shroud, I'll start to turn the craft at a 90-degree angle to the right. This will align me in a parallel orientation with the surface of the planet. And after I accelerate to 2,000 meters a second, we'll be in what's called an orbit, like a satellite. And that's because my forward momentum doesn't subtract from the downward force of gravity. So they both kind of add together and I end up in a diagonal loop around the planet. I always like to watch the first stage kind of float away like that. It almost looks like it's accelerating from me, but we know I'm accelerating from it. And that's the beauty of perspective. Without knowing about the acceleration, it would just look like they're drifting apart. You need a third object in the vicinity to reference to, like the planet, to know who is accelerating from whom. Here we can see that trajectory line moving across the planet and now connecting to the other side. The 300-130 is now stuck on a circular path around the planet until I deaccelerate. And now we still have the first stage to go back to, but let's check out what was in that payload fairing. It's a giant aircraft fuel tank. And now why bring such large tanks into space? To build this. A massive interplanetary ship that I can only build once all the parts are in orbit. And now playing in career mode, you can regain some of your funds by recovering the vessel on the surface of the planet. This first stage here will be coming down in a straight line, which is normally a very dangerous maneuver. This gives us less atmosphere to deaccelerate with, compared to going diagonally or horizontally. However, this ship is designed to be very flat on the bottom, which causes a lot of drag as the air kind of compresses and has to force itself out of the way. And so as we get to thicker atmosphere, we'll start to slow down more quickly. And once we're going slow enough, I'll activate the parachutes, which will bring us down to a nice landing speed. Oh, and I almost hit a tree there, but it looks like we're coming in for a good landing. And so we have high frame rate, memory usage as well, temperatures up to 70 Celsius, which is normal for these cards. If you buy a more powerful card or have one that's gotten a little bit more dusty, it could get even higher, up to the 80 mark. And now for the 2880 by 1620 test, I'll fly this supersonic jet, which I've named the Flash, which I've designed just for this benchmark. So sit back in your seat and hold on, because we're going to be going pretty fast. And so it got up to 1,000 meters a second, which is a little over 2,000 miles an hour. I have to be careful not to turn the craft too sharply, as the atmosphere will rip it apart at these speeds. I know we can't see the air, but basically the faster we go, the more we have to push those molecules out of our way. At a fast enough speed, it would almost be like hitting a brick wall, but right now it's like trying to sprint through a pool of water. If you can just imagine running through a pool of water, sort of compressing and pushing it out of the way as you go, you face a lot of resistance, which I can use here to slow down the craft in order to make a safe landing on the runway. I don't want to go too slowly, as there won't be enough air going around the wings, and I'll lose my lift and drop like a stone. I need to apply the brakes, but not too much, as I could lose control. Oh, that was a close one. These parts are made of toothpicks. They just break apart anytime you touch the ground. And so we can see the higher resolution and those special thruster smoke effects were cutting the frame rate down to about half. And so concluding the gaming benchmarks, as I said before, if you're planning to run a higher resolution monitor like a 4K, possibly 120 or 144 Hertz, and desire the highest graphic settings as well, you're gonna want a faster video card. And now we'll move over to the editing benchmarks. Here I'm just playing and swiping back and forth on 2 layers of 1080p. In this simple test, the processor has taken the lead with 82% usage. High memory usage as well. This is unrendered footage, which means the computer has to combine all the clips and apply special effects on the fly. As I start the render, we can see the CPU cores jump up to 100%, 68 Celsius, which is the highest so far for this component. The GPU did hit 99% usage, but was only at 57 degrees, which tells me that the overall workload wasn't that high. And now I don't normally render my footage. It can speed up the playback, but on this PC, the playback is fast enough that it's almost unnecessary. Next, I'll do a full export. This is what creates the video file that gets uploaded to YouTube. And so as we see here, with high numbers on the CPU again, a faster chip or one with more cores will speed up this application, which mainly applies to rendering and exporting. And so if those are the two things you do the most, a faster chip will be most beneficial. I don't export that often either, as I typically spend weeks in the editing room. I focus heavily on quality, and so this build here is going to be perfect for me. Last up is a special stress test. I'm going to stack a bunch of applications on top of each other. Sometimes I have a game going in the background, like Kerbal Space, then a music video, which will be this browser here, and then the video editor as well. They all share the same resource, and so they all slow down. They all bottleneck each other. While the memory just keeps stacking up, the more programs you have running. Once you run out, it'll switch to virtual memory written off the hard drive, and so it'll slow down. And we see in this test here, it almost hit 10 gigs of video memory, which gives me some peace of mind about buying that 12 gig card. 6 gigabits of that was from Kerbal Space, and so you might not run into that issue yourself unless you're heavily multitasking. And now let's check out those awesome LEDs. I moved the 5 volts to the sides and installed 12 volt in the top and bottom. Rainbow is the default pattern when it first starts up, but I can change the color with just a click of a button. That right there is pretty cool. I don't have to buy new bulbs just to change the color. Now, I'm pretty familiar with LEDs. I've made a couple videos of hooking them up to batteries to make flashlights. You can check that out if you want to try to make your own flashlight. Here's the classic breathing animation. You can change the color, change the speed. We are looking into the computer with the side panel on. It's made of tempered glass. It has a very high clarity. Tempering is a specific heat treatment that will induce stress in the material to resist outside blunt force. This is a glass channel. I do mention annealing a lot. Tempering is basically the opposite. Here we have Starry Night. You might notice the 5 volt addressable LEDs in the sides can change to different colors and brightnesses at the same time, whereas the 12 volt non-addressables have to change all at the same time. Here we have a CPU monitor which can change between 3 different zones depending on CPU usage or temperature. Next, the adaptive setting can change the lights to try to match which colors are on the screen. I think it does have potential, but I'm just having trouble getting the right setting. You select the area on the screen for which colors to match. And if the video has very solid colors like a forest or an ocean, then it should adapt pretty well. And now for music reactive, it reacts to sound.
And we got magnetism.
Wow, look at that. All right, look at that. It's working. It looks like the spikes are kind of waving back and forth as I rotate the magnet. Running a test of rubbing the magnets perpendicular and parallel with the coils to see which one would produce the most power. I started with a simple vessel filled with iron filings to a device that can generate power. I'm really curious and excited to find out where this is going to lead. You can comment with any scientific questions, but make sure to share this video as well. That way others may find their way to the mesmerizingly mysterious Matt Jasa channel. There were reactive light kits back then. However, it was a little microphone you had to hide in the case, while this one watches the sound panel and gets the information from the decibel display. This is the Aura Creator. I can take those effects and put them together to create new animations. I'll put comment on both strips, and you'll see that the 12 volt can't replicate those effects as it's non-addressable. So I'll match it up with some other effects and try to make a good animation for you. And now I'm not sure if Aura Creator can be installed on non-Asus boards, but I'm sure there's other software out there that will do the same thing, possibly more. So here's what I got so far. Starry Night on the sides, green and purple comets that come down and flash across the bottom. And then the 12 volts are also set to CPU temperature monitor, while the 5 volts are set to music reactive. And I think I have the right strip turned upside down, as the comments are going up. But I like it. It looks like it's pulsing through the computer. Lastly, let's go over some tips you should know before you start the build. As I said before, we have to match the CPU and the memory to the motherboard. And so if they have a compatibility list, you can just pick your parts off of there. And it's always best to get the newest generation of technology released. If I would have waited a couple months, I could have gotten the one 3600, which has 8 E-cores instead of 4. And so that's probably the one you'll want to get, unless it's been a while since this has been uploaded. Then you'll just want to get the most recent one released. But with that said, I do want to mention a good caveat, a big warning. If it's a newer technology or a newer form factor, like the 2.M is to the SATA, then it might be best to wait a few years before you invest into it. The 2.Ms were much more expensive when they first came out, same thing with the SATA drives. They were $1 a gig. And so if you wanted a terabyte of space, you'd have to spend $1,000. And that's true with most technologies. Televisions, media players, media recorders. It takes a while for the manufacturing to get better. That way they can make it real cheap. It's also good to avoid shocking your parts with static electricity. They have anti-static wristbands you can wear and attach to the case, which should help dissipate any static charge you've built up. If you don't have that, you can periodically touch a metal part of your case or some other metal object to try to dissipate your charge. It's also best to handle the parts by the sides or corners. You want to avoid touching the top parts or the back soldered areas. I also wouldn't recommend doing your build on carpet. A hard surface may be better, like a kitchen table. If not, maybe the kitchen floor. And now if you need to build a simple editing machine and you're on a tight budget, you could get away without a video card. Intel's K chip does come with a built-in GPU, which is powerful enough for the desktop, the browser, very simple applications. The KF chip does not come with the GPU, but it's a little bit cheaper. All the editing will be done on the i5, which is powerful enough by itself. However, it is a very heavy load, and so it does run pretty hot. But besides that, you do sacrifice a great deal of power in rendering and export. Those processes will seem to take 3 to 4 times longer. And of course, it's not powerful enough to run any of the games I benchmarked without a dedicated GPU. And now, there's a lot of CPU coolers out there. The AIO All-in-One is a self-contained water cooling loop. It gives you access to water cooling and is simple to install. You can plug it straight into the motherboard, which makes it even easier. I'm not sure if it's as effective as a custom-built loop. I've never tried it myself. There are more moving parts involved, and so I'm afraid something's gonna break down along the way. And now, if you're planning to do voiceover, you might not want to install too many fans or ones that are too powerful, as it does add up in background noise. Although the motherboard's audio isn't bad, I do want to opt for something better for voice recording. And so I chose an external USB audio interface with phantom power and gain controls. It also has its own drivers, and so it acts like an external sound card, but just for input. I can also plug in an instrument cable and play the guitar straight into the computer. However, anything you record is going to be in mono, as the condenser microphone and guitar are both mono instruments. You can fix that with editing software, or use a special cable that will split it from mono to stereo. Well, I think that's about it. If there's anything I forgot, I'll include it into the show more below or in the top of the comment section. I hope you found this video helpful and that you have a fun time building your machine. Now I'll be getting back to GWG, Gaming with Glass, which is my new gaming series. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the next episode, here on the Matt Jasa channel.